This tutorial looks at the first trigonometric ratio in a little bit of detail. So in our tutorial last day, we saw that there are three trigonometric ratios: the sine, the cosine, and the tangent ratio. And depending on the information you're given, that's when you use the ratio. So we're going to practice identifying the information, and we're going to make sure we understand which ratio to use. So relative to angle A, that's what we're looking at in these two ratios. We can look at any angle we want, and then the words opposite change. Hypotenuse is always the hypotenuse. So relative to angle A, the hypotenuse is always the hypotenuse, but this side right here would be opposite of angle A, and this side right here would be an adjacent to angle A. And this is what we talked about last day, understanding the words opposite and adjacent. So what we're going to do in today's tutorial is we're going to use the sine ratio to solve three different kinds of triangle problems. And again, this sine ratio only works when you have the opposite information and the hypotenuse. It doesn't work with any other combination. So just to make sure we can write the ratio and see the ratio, I want to determine the sine ratios for angle A and angle B. So let's highlight angle A in blue. So the sine ratio of angle A is the side opposite, which is 12, over the hypotenuse, which is 13. So a really good thing to do in any right triangle problem is always identify the hypotenuse right away. And as soon as we do that, then we only have two other sides to worry about. If we look at side B, well, the sine of side B, well, the sine ratio is the opposite side to the hypotenuse, and we already know the hypotenuse is 13, and the side opposite of angle B is 5. So these are the sine ratios, and that's what they are. All we're doing is plugging the right number, the right piece of information into the right place, much like we did when we did Pythagoras. So as soon as we are confident that we know what to plug in where, well, then we can go ahead and solve triangle questions. Now, the only kind of questions you can answer in a triangle are what's an angle and what's a side. And we're going to do the one thing that Pythagorean theorem can't do. We're going to solve an angle first. And this turns out to be actually the easiest kind of question to answer in trigonometry, and we'll look at that in a minute. So I'm just going to sketch a triangle. It doesn't have to be perfect. And I'm going to call this angle A. Remember, here's our hypotenuse, and I always call it angle C. So I'm going to label my triangle ABC, and there's my hypotenuse right there. And I know that the sine of angle A is 4 over 5. And remember what the sine of the angle is. It's the opposite side compared to the hypotenuse. So in this case right here, the opposite is the 4. So the side opposite of angle A is 4, and the hypotenuse is 5, and the hypotenuse always goes there. So here's what we have. We have this picture right here. Now, Pythagoras could help us figure out the bottom side, but I don't care about that right now. All I want to do is figure out the angle. And this is really easy to do. And here's all you have to do. In order to figure out an angle, we need only to push a button on our calculator. And if we're looking at the sine, well, we're going to push that sine. So I'm going to show you my calculator here, but any decent scientific calculator will have this, and I want you to look right here at the sine button, the SIN button. And right above the sine button in blue, you will see SIN to the -1. So I'm just going to imagine I zoomed in on that. And here's our calculator. And this is the sine button. And right above the sine button is this button right here. And the blue symbol is the button that gives us the answer to the question. It literally tells us what the answer is. So in order to find an angle when we're using the sine ratio, we have to press second sine. So if we go ahead, and I'm going to do this in a sec, if we go ahead and press second sine, what my calculator does is it shows that, and it'll even have brackets. And then what we simply do is we put in the ratio. And in this example, the ratio is 4/5, and we enter that as 4 divided by 5. And as soon as we do that, we'll hit enter, and the calculator will tell us the answer. So let me just go ahead and do that. Again, I want to find an angle, so I don't want the sine, I want the second sine. And then my calculator says, well, what do you want? What are the sides? Tell me the sides. And I go ahead and I plug in my sides. My calculator spits out 53.13. And what my calculator is telling me is this angle is 53 degrees. So here's one of the questions we have to be able to solve, and Pythagoras doesn't do it, but trigonometry does, and it turns out to be the easiest one. And we're going to get lots of practice with this because we're going to do the exact same thing when we do cosine. We're going to do the exact same thing when we do tangent. So whenever you find an angle, it is always that button right there. Okay. Well, let's look at the other two kinds of equations we have to be able to solve. And it's when we're trying to find a side. So look at these two triangles here. And what I want you to recognize is you only have one side, and Pythagorean theorem won't work. And again, as I suggest, the very first thing you want to do is highlight the hypotenuse. So I'm going to do them in both examples right now, seeing as they're up there. Now, the other thing we wanted to do is I wanted you to write down what I know. So we talked about this last tutorial, last video. What do I know? And again, I'm always going to label an angle A. So in this question here, what do I know? Well, I know angle A. I know the hypotenuse. And what do I want to know? I want to know that side. And that side is the opposite side. And again, when you look at these two things right here, what you hopefully see is, hey, those are the two words in my sine ratio formula. And that's going to tell us to do the sine ratio. And then what we're simply going to do is now we're going to simply substitute in the information into the right place. So we have the sine of angle A, and angle A is equal to 32 degrees, is equal to the opposite side. Well, the side opposite, we don't know, over the hypotenuse. So here's our equation, and what I want you to notice is there is only one unknown, and we can go ahead and solve it. And all we have to understand is this stuff over here is simply a number that our calculator will give us. So again, just a number from our calculator. And this is all pre-programmed. Your calculator knows the sine, the cosine of every possible angle that you could plug in, and this is the one we want. So let me show you that. I'm going to simply punch sine of 32, and I'm going to hit enter, and there's what it gives me. My calculator gives me a number. So the first thing I suggest we do in any one of the problems we're looking at right now is whenever you see the sine of an angle, punch it into your calculator and have your calculator tell you what it is. So I'm going to go ahead and write that because a number is nicer than those weird letters. And at this point right here, we just have to remember, how do you solve this kind of equation? And we're always going to do the same thing. And the way you solve this kind of equation, in order to isolate x, what we simply do is we multiply over the number on the bottom. So what we're simply going to do is we're going to multiply that number over, and here's what we get. And now everything can be done on our calculator. 11.5 times 0.5299. And when we do that, we get 6.09. So let's call that 6.1. So what we've done is we've solved one of the kind of equations. And in this equation, the answer is 6.1. And we always want to ask ourselves, does that make sense? And the way we check our answer is we know the hypotenuse is the longest side of a right triangle. And as long as our answer is smaller than the hypotenuse, we probably did it right. So again, here's the second kind of equation you're going to solve. And again, the second kind is when the unknown, so the unknown, call it x, is on top. And the way we simply do it is we multiply over. Okay, well, let's look at the last kind of equation we have to solve. So again, what do I know? What do I know? Well, I know angle E, and I want to know the hypotenuse. That's what the question's asking. And I know that side right there, which is opposite angle E. And again, what that tells us to do is to use the sine ratio, just like we did on the left-hand side. So now what I'm simply going to do is, just like we did over here, I'm going to substitute. And then I'm going to go ahead and solve. So when we substitute in, we get the sine of 55 is equal to 6.8 over the hypotenuse. And I'm just going to call it x. So I want you to look at these two equations and notice that they're almost the same. The only difference is in the one on the left, the x is on the top. The one on the right, the x is on the bottom. But again, we have that sine 55, so we're going to push the button on our calculator, and I'm just going to tell you what it is. When you press sine 55, here's what you get. So again, it's still looking exactly like we did on here. We just pushed a button on our calculator. But here's how you solve these kind. Algebraically, these are a bit trickier, but as a way of doing it, it's really straightforward. Here's all you do. You just interchange these two numbers, these two things. So again, I'm not going to get into the algebra of it, but this is what we just have to remember. And with a little bit of practice, we'll get good at solving these equations. And now when you plug that into your calculator, you get 8.3. So when you divide 6.8 by 0.8191, you get 8.3. And again, we ask ourselves, does that answer make sense? And 8.3 is bigger than 6.8, which means our hypotenuse is bigger than the other side. That makes sense. So here's a quick example of our first new formula that will help us answer triangle questions that Pythagorean theorem won't do for us. So here's our two key ideas from today. The first key idea is you know when to use the sine ratio. And again, you know when to use the sine ratio when you write down what I know and you get opposite and hypotenuse information. And the other key idea is how to solve the three kinds of equations. And there's only three. So the first one was find an angle, and that's just pushing a button on our calculator. The second one was when the x is on top, and we simply multiply over. And the third one was when the x is on the bottom, and then we simply interchange.